Hello, welcome to the Meeting Tent, an ongoing series on the work of Stan Tenen. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our usual cast of characters: Michael Andron, Levon Tenen, Adele Packer, and Daniel Gill. So before we get started today, we have a little presentation that Adele's going to provide for us. I'm going to turn it over to her to lay out the context, and we'll watch a little video. So take it away, Adele.
In 2019, I created an evening of dance that was based in many respects, although it was also my imagination taking the letters and their mystical meanings and looking at the creation stories that come out of the Zohar and how the letters were the foundations of all that is. And Stan's work was very much present in everything I was doing at the time. I had learned the gestural language and was incorporating it into the dance. And I wanted a way for the audience to kind of sit back and take a deep breath and begin to be in a state where they could join the sense of embodiment of this work. So this very short animation was created to show the letters falling, and they fall in a reciprocal spiral, this beautiful spiral that fit in the hand that became the hand model, that set the shape of the hands in every gesture. And so using my imagination with a film animator, we took photos of that were created by the Hubble telescope at that time, and looked at all the beauty of our universe. And it's set to music, and we'll put the credits for all of the people involved. So you will have that. And I'm just going to share it with you now. So anybody who's listening, if you just sit easily in your chair with your feet on the ground and enjoy a few full breaths as you watch this.
Very cool. So the string of letters, was that from Bereshit?
No, that was literally the alphabet in the order of the alphabet. And the letters were very specific fonts that were created by an artist from Israel named Baum, Josh Baum. And by some crazy coincidence, I learned that he was a cousin of mine through
No.
my brother who does genealogy. Don't ask me. But I found his letters on the internet and said, this is perfect. They're whimsical and unique. And I'm going to ask permission to
Wow.
use them. And he allowed me to use them. And then later I found out he was my cousin. So
Uh,
that's just synchronicity is always interesting in life. But the way the letters came down, I imagined them coming down in that spiral. And the reason they rose back up were the stories of our prayers that sometimes we can't quite find the words, but it doesn't matter. The intention goes up and God understands our prayers. So the idea of the letters coming down and creating all that is, and then those same letters being our gift back up again. It was just a moment of trying to put into some kind of visual expression what we were feeling very strongly about the beauty of what we were doing with this project.
Nice. So the letters seem to have tagine. Was that for, they were the Torah script?
Yeah, they're and again they're very whimsical. I mean, some letters are huge and they're smaller, and the smallest letters are sometimes large, and that it was just an artist's interpretation. And yes, he did play with the crowns on the letters. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, you brought up a term that we're going to be discussing today, and I think this kind of inspired you to show this to us today, the reciprocal spiral. And I've got to tell you that for some of us, we're way out of our league on this discussion. It is something that Michael and I discussed this earlier. We could go through our whole lives and not even be aware of this specific terminology or this principle. However, it was important to stand for many reasons, and it's a predominant factor in the book. So if you go through the book, you'll see it shows up in many different examples. And we're going to try to show the importance of this particular spiral. But the main important factor is that it is the spiral that models the model hand, and therefore emanates from the first verse of the Hebrew text of Genesis. So that in itself should, be an interesting reason to explore it. If you have our book, you'll see it mentioned several times, and we'll be showing graphics from the book. And in fact, why don't I put it up on the screen so we can see what we're talking about? Let's see here. This is this is the digital version of the book. So in the digital version, it's on page 166 and 167. But if you look at the drawing on the right and the left part of it, this is what could be considered the reciprocal spiral. The important thing to stand in the way this spiral is shaped is that it moves to infinity. It starts as a circle and then it just goes out. And it was important to him to point out that this was unlike other spirals. And I think, Levana, maybe you want to
Yeah,
talk about
I can kind of take it from there, I think.
Yeah.
The idea is if you take a look at this spiral, if you actually analyze it analytically, the curvature at every single point is actually different if you were to check the equation for the curvature. And there's a concept in you know, in algebraic representation of these things called a limit. And what that means is that this thing, this curve, you have to think of it as being constantly moving around in its own shape, in the shape that you see. And it's always, each end is always approaching that limit. Now, the limit of the straight line that's pointing down in this diagram to the right, yeah, the limit of that is 1, you know, y. This is being modeled on a Cartesian coordinate axis. There's an x-axis, there's a y-axis. The x-axis is the vertical axis in this case, and the y-axis is the horizontal axis. And, you know, if you remember your geometry, you can measure these things, you know, where y equals 1, y equals 2, x equals 1, etc. That's how you plot points. Okay. So this curve, that down sweeping line, approaches 1, but mathematically it never reaches it. It's just, it's like, if you recall, there's something called Zeno's paradox, you know, back in ancient Greece mathematics, where somebody is walking towards a particular place and each step they take is half the size of the last one. Well, if you just think about it, you realize, you know, it will wind up being infinitesimal, but nonetheless, you know, just really, really, really teeny, but nonetheless, logically, he'll never get there because each step is half the size of the last one. So you never quite get there. But the destination, that 1, is the limit. That point that you see in the middle is called the origin. Mathematically, it says that this curve strangles the origin. It's a terrible word, but what it means is that you could, okay, in this case, the drawing itself stops where the curve hits that y-axis again, right around the origin, Bill. Yeah, and go to your left, go to the drawing's left. Yeah, okay. You can see that the curve stops at the line that's labeled y-axis, but
yeah.
if that particular curve just kept going and going and going and going, it's approaching that central point, but again, never reaches it. Just as a parenthetical aside, this was always a problem when we were trying to get the hand model, which mathematically is shaped based on that curve. When 3D printers first came out, and we were seeing if people could create an algorithmic way, you know, a file to input to the printer so that they could print the hand model, and people kept coming up on the fact that if they used the mathematical specification for this curve, that central point, the point where the curve starts mathematically, would cause the math to blow up because you wind up dividing by infinity, which you can't do, you know, certainly a computer can't do. So anyway, that is the reciprocal spiral, which is also called, no, that's a logarithmic spiral on an Archimedean spiral on the left.
But on the right, we're seeing
right, the reciprocal / hyperbolic spiral is on the top on the right, and there's a related form called the lituus, which is on the bottom. We don't really actually need to get into that.
It was important for Stan to point out that this logarithmic spiral and the Archimedean spiral did not fit on the cube octahedron, and it was therefore.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and there's a philosophical reason, which is that in both of those cases, the curvature of the line never changes. It's always the same.
Right.
If you're looking for a metaphor for the way life processes work. Think about life. It's always changing. The current moment is always transitioning to the next one, and it's never the same. This reciprocal hyperbolic spiral, the curve is always changing. It is not the same at any 2 points. Even where it looks like a straight line, it isn't really. If you zoomed in on it, you'd see. So philosophically, that is a better metaphor for what people tend to think of life as a spiral, recurring but always different. Well, this is truly always different, whereas the logarithmic spirals or the Archimedean spiral, there it's very easy to see. The curvature is always the same.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the book, Stan refers to these as narcissistic.
Well, okay, let's set that aside for a moment. You will find descriptions in the book of this which there were issues that we had during the late 80s and 90s, when it was very popular for people to get fascinated with Fibonacci numbers, with so-called golden spirals. And this was a problem for us because it led to a lot of errors, because it was philosophically wrong and there were other issues involved. So for people who were actually into the math, which many people, particularly at that time, who were interested in our work and attracted to it, they did come from the perspective of the geometrical models. Their favorite film was often the first one, The Geometric Metaphors of Life. And to try and basically set the record straight. So I will say this to people watching this video, that if mathematical or geometric metaphors for life processes are not your thing, don't worry about it. There are other aspects of our work which wind up pointing to the same areas because it's all one work. But if it's not your thing, don't worry about it. If it is your thing, then it will speak to you. And in some cases, like I see Adele nodding, her work as a dancer involves enacting geometry on her body with the feeling of her body, melding those two together. And so basically embodies these ideas, which for Stanley originated in what mathematicians would call beautiful relationships, and being able to translate them into an embodied form that people who are not mathematically minded can still relate to. That's one reason why I was really happy when Adele joined us some years ago, and became interested in our work and was able to appreciate how the geometry could work itself out on her body. Because that was something that Stanley always thought should happen, but he was in no way was he a dancer. Forget it, and except for dealing with the letter gestures, I mean, he could see that this was a valuable thing, but actually working with it had to wait for somebody whose talent that was to show up. And so you did. So I know, and Bill chose the reciprocal spiral as something to focus on, and the section of the book that he was talking about does show that, in fact,
Well, let's show some examples.
Yeah, the spirals that we see in nature very often No, they're not logarithmic spirals. They're actually reciprocal spirals, which are also called sometimes called hyperbolic spirals. If you want to Google them, you'll see it either way. Okay, now here we get into the torus knots, which is related. Gosh.
Well, I wanted to show the other graphics first because these are things people could relate to. So they're in the Appendix J in the book. We have examples of the reciprocal spiral, in this case, in nature. And we can see the whirlpool, the galaxy, hurricanes, an elephant's trunk, fishtailing, Leonardo's heart flow vortices, jet contrails.
Clever, sharp-eyed people will see that the one G, the fern, is actually a lituus, which is a related spiral. It basically, instead of the curve approaching 1, the curve is somewhat more curved and actually approaches 0. Don't worry about it if that just made no sense to you.
Yay!
Okay, here
But
we
Michael,
have.
if you have specific questions, seriously ask them to me, and if I have an answer for you,
No, it's okay. It's not where my mind has too many points of reference, and it's just I find it fascinating to look at and sort of follow along with what you're saying or what was in the book, but it's not talking to me like it talked to Stan for sure.
Well, yeah, and I have to agree with that. But like you said, I could skip that chapter and still get a wealth of information. Here we have the reciprocal spiral in art and tradition. And again, we're always referring back to the ancient world, where perhaps this was more of a natural phenomenon. But as you can see, the Ionic capital, the Eye of Horus, the pharaonic crown, it always comes back to Egypt on some level. The Book of Kells. This, I'm sure, has to do with all that 10 years that Stan's spent, studying every
studying
culture.
everything.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we were able to finally apply it. And then here we have in math and physics, there's a lot. He writes a lot about the smoke ring gun, and it shows examples of how the specific smoke ring the smoke that comes out of this particular smoke ring gun also comes out comes out in this shape from the bellows. Bellows were an important form of technology in the ancient world. Satellite escape trajectory, the Helios, I don't know what that is, Siegel.
Oh, that is, yeah, it's, okay, well, it's the path outlined by the sun on a sundial at noon over a 1-year period.
All right, okay.
Great.
Family curves, what is that? Family curves on the bottom right.
Computer-generated plot shows the paths of light rays sucked into an optical black hole.
Okay.
It's a family of reciprocal spirals, quasi-reciprocal spirals, and lituus spirals.
Amazing.
Okay, Daniel,
Yeah,
think of all this.
yeah. Well, I mean, other than there's the obvious musical reference of the violin.
Violin. Well, is there
Yeah.
a reason? Is there a reason they have that shape, or is that just decor?
It's no sonic reason. It's just an ornament. There's some more than conjecture by the scholarly musical community that violins are indeed, or the violin family is indeed a Jewish instrument, meaning it was made by Jews. and it may make you smile, but there's some real evidence, and it's not like, only some Jewish scholars. I think the research I read is from a non-Jewish scholar, I forgot his name, but there's a coincidence of the printing press and a large Jewish community centering around Cremona, right around the time of the violin. So, the most famous violins in the world to this day, and come from or are patterned after the Cremonese school, and no one's got it better in over 500 years now. It's simply whatever they did there is the best it ever got. And a lot of those instruments are still around. I mean, having been fixed and with new necks and whatever, but still,
Yeah.
the basic instrument. And that also coincides with the printing press and all sorts of other things. So a lot of the first Jewish books are printed in Cremona. There's a misunderstanding, I would say, in the academic community who studies the Zohar, which as they date the publication of the Zohar from the publication of the Zohar, meaning they date from its first printing and who did the printing and who got it together. But what they fail to understand is there is a real trail of scholarship based on the Zohar that predates that publication. So meaning before the printing press, and then this comes from a misinformation about how Jews have studied for so long. So we had books and scripts and scrolls and things that people studied for 1,000 years, at least 2,000 years before the printing press, period. And there's a track record for that. And so when you look at the Zohar and you say, well, it was only first published here, it was published by Moshe de Leon and like whatever, it's like, obviously he made it up. And it's like, well, the reason that the more religious scholarly community scoffs at that is because there's no understanding of the history of Jewish scholarship and how serious it was and what it encompassed, and that there's ample proof that people are quoting the Zohar long before the Zohar was, quote, discovered or published. And it was a different scene, and it's not, it's like a retroactive kind of looking at history. Anyway, that aside, there is I know Stan had a big issue with this also, so it's worth mentioning. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that, so the correlation, there might be, I don't know if it's causal, who knows, but there is correlation between that scroll on the violin and the viola and the cello and the Jewish community in Cremona. So it's definitely possible that there's some connection. And again, you did take some funding to try to really kind of figure that out. The other thing is that the spiral is indeed described almost exactly mathematically in the book Shefatal. Period. I mean, we looked at it together years ago. I remember when I found it. I was at your house and we are just kind of looking through, and you mentioned something. I said, "Well, hey, look what I just found," and I read it out loud, and it's pretty much exactly the description. A line. I mean, he described it from the line point of view, from the straight point of view. A line that curves and continuously curves more and more as it reaches the center. And the Shefatal has like a kind of crude, but this kind of like spiral shape, this triangle kind of shape. And he's got all the sphirot in there, the tree of life, so to speak, and all these different permutations. And he says that this shape that he just described is the shape of the sphirot, that the reciprocal spiral is the shape of the sphirot. And so what's fascinating about that is I was just listening to this interesting podcast, and they were discussing the concept of time, and how if you look at physics, and especially quantum physics, but if you look at physics, like time is not necessarily relevant in terms of figuring out equations. It doesn't matter really. What matters is the momentary. So there's some theories that actually consciousness is like time is a construct. and there's also theories that time and space are a construct that we use to organize things. And so if you think about like consciousness, you know, if I said to you, well, what color was your great aunt wearing when you went on a walk in the forest? You would go, what? Who cares? Right? Because what matters about that walk is that you had a nice time with your aunt. So you might remember the walk, right? But you're not going to remember, at least consciously, what she was wearing, right? So, and sometimes memories that are really strong, for good or bad, are so strong that they seem like they're still right there. And this seems to be because the only constant is this constant changing. So it's not the technical, well, that happened so many years ago and it was at this time and in this space and blah, blah, blah. It more has to do with like, what does it mean to the human being and to consciousness? So what, you know, it's those changes. And so if you're here and you go all the way to here, something really good happens, or God forbid, something really bad happens, you remember the change. You remember the change. And so, because it's so abrupt. So there's something to do with this concept of the Sphirot. I can't quite grok it, but there's something to do with the concept of the Sphirot and the reciprocal spiral and consciousness, and also the refinement of consciousness, the elevation of consciousness, that Stan, I think, was right onto. And quite honestly, you don't really need, it's interesting if you understand the mathematics. You don't need to understand the mathematics, right? Just if you can hold your hands that way, or if we can eventually hopefully get the hand model printed, that's really what matters. You know what I mean? Like Stan, I think, used to say, like, you don't need to understand about a nice car to get in it and drive it. You know what I mean? Like, so what Stan did, Stan's like the master builder. He built this car or this vehicle, right? And we can drive it. And I think that's the thing. Anyone who's listening now, this could be the most important thing to give funding to and to give money to, because it's what Stan built here and what Meir Foundation built, Stan and Levana built together is a vehicle by which human beings can learn to understand and refine the fundamental elements of consciousness, and how and how the world around us can be subtly and kind of sequentially built to a higher state because we're raising ourselves up.
Mhm.
Oh, thanks for that soundbite. I can definitely, I'll be able to use that one for.
Please, yeah.
One more thing.
I write this down all before, you know what I mean? I've prepared, I've got that.
And of course, another example here, we've talked about this several times, is the Inyan. And another example of the reciprocal spiral. We've spent several episodes discussing this principle, but I just did want to point this out, that it was the whole point of this, the ability to generate the alphabet from this device from Yehuda Halevi. So I don't want to go into it again. It is in the book, but another example of this concept. I think now that we've discussed it, Michael, maybe we'll start seeing examples, and it may enter into our awareness.
That's certainly what happened to us and to Stanley. A lot of those samples from nature that you see, that we saw in that appendix, samples from nature, samples from scientific articles. If he subscribed to a lot of magazines, science magazines, whatever. And when he would see something that looked like, a sample of that particular spiral form, he'd note it. He'd say, scan this article or download it or whatever. So those are some of the best ones that are in that appendix. But yeah, you do start to see it all over.
I wonder if the curve in the violin came out of an earlier to the inception of the tree to some curvature in the tree, the wood itself. That, you know, sculptors will tell you this, no, you can't do that. You'd be somehow, you know, ignoring the way the wood works.
Mhm.
And I wonder if that somehow was an earlier something embedded, just like in the picture of the embryo taking that same curve in utero, whether that's something in the wood itself that was used. Is it always the same wood?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
It's usually the neck and the head are maple.
Mhm.
The tiger maple a lot of times are kind of a maple that's got a lot of beauty to it. And the sides and the back are maple, and the top is spruce, Sitka spruce,
You
tight
know,
grain
each,
spruce.
Question is, does it have any effect on the audio, on the sonic?
The spiral, I mean, everything, it's a small instrument, so everything affects it somewhat. Even the cello is relatively, it's big, but it's not enormous. I mean,
And-
everything changes it, including the wood type. But
even the string itself is wound around a key, like on the same as a guitar or a piano. It's wound around in that kind of spiral fashion and then coming out into an elongated string.
Gee,
And
you're
I
already
wonder,
doing it, Michael.
they sort of resonate.
You're
yeah,
already-
well, and,
I don't
yeah.
know what I'm talking about.
No, it's
so
true.
it's
I mean,
amazing.
actually, I mean, the
Yeah,
violin
it's
is the violin's an old. I mean, it's really an old. I mean, all stringed instruments can date back probably to Pythagoras, and his the monochord, where he had, you know, where he was testing mathematic ratios, which is basically two, you know, a string with something in the middle of a certain type of metal or whatever it was, and then you move you get different pitches by moving. You change the ratio between
Yeah.
the longer and shorter side, whatever, and you get at different tensions. You get different sounds, and so that was very mathematically important to Pythagoras and scientifically interesting. And so the violin, if you really look at any string instrument, it's like even an electric guitar. It's the same thing basically as Pythagoras had. I mean, so much of music is totally ancient, actually.
Wow.
Actually, you know, with regards to the thing about something natural in the wood, Bill, if you could go back to figure J4.
Okay, give me a minute. Give me a second here. J4, got it. Okay, hold on. Screen sharing this.
Okay, and if you can hone in on figure H, that actually it's a close-up of a wood shaving. That dark gray thing is the chisel, and the shaving, it's shaving just a plank of wood. But you could look at the shape of the curve of the shaving itself as it's coming off of the plank of wood. It's the same spiral.
That's cool.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I didn't mention that before. So, I mean,
Amazing.
it's just, yeah. And I'm sure there's so many more that we can, that and I invite our audience to go out and, you know, in your lives, you may see other examples of this. Yeah, Adele.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I actually played the violin for 10 years when I was growing up. And I so appreciate the instrument because I know how hard it is to play. But I think that spiral is embodied in the violinist. The violin is not just going It's like there's a motion and there's a finish to a note where the body spirals off the strings. And there's something about the sound that's circling inside this box and flowing out. So I can't imagine any other shape that would be put at the end of a violin. It just seems perfect to the form. And I was just thinking too about why this was so inspiring, because there were I love math. I mean, I've always loved math. I was always good at math. I'm not great at math now, but I was really good at math growing up. And I went all the way through calculus, without a calculator. We used a slide ruler.
Slide
and-
rule.
Slide
Yeah.
rules,
Slide ruler. I guess crazy. I feel really old even saying it. But anyway, it was fascinating to me, and I just always loved math. And so when I saw this body of work, it intrigued me, even when I didn't understand it. There's a beauty to geometry and to the figures, and to see even the spheroid in dots on the page, and to see, oh, there's space. Dancers love spatial design. It's not, sorry, there's some noise interference. It should be finished soon. Yeah, and so we take those shapes into space. It's how we walk on the floor or how we carve the space. It's not just a shape that's still. It's something in many forms we can use as inspiration for creating relationship with yourself in the space, with yourself and another dancer, and what's happening inside you. So it's many, many layers, and I felt like there's a lifetime of creative resource for movement people in this book, or sculptors or musicians, that it stimulates creativity when lines are curving as opposed to something that's static. Yeah.
Again,
Yes.
movement.
Say that that the point of geometry is that we live in it.
Yeah.
That okay, our lives are not sharply pointed tetrahedra or whatever. Those are our idealizations. Although this is a pretty well defined shape. There it is. But in fact, our bodies live in 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions if you consider movement and want to call it a dimension, which many people do. And that what Adele said is very important as to how and why this is so, because we live with our movements. We live in space. We move through space. And we tend to do this in curvilinear motions. I mean, we're not a marching band. We don't go in straight lines. We tend, and those of us who have the good fortune to be healthy, we don't jitter from place to place unless we're extremely anxious or have certain illnesses. But even then, it's still, we live in bodies, therefore we live in geometry, because our bodies have shape, our bodies have form, our space, our rooms have shape and form. And the kind of idealizations that people like Stanley worked with or work with, they are ways, similarly to the way in which philosophers abstract their thought to logical propositions. You can abstract shape and motion to things which can be reproduced and quantified, and then study their properties, study their relationships, and see where that takes you. If you know people who are honest to goodness mathematicians, their creative work seems very abstract to everyone except other mathematicians. But a word that they use to describe something which is, they use words like elegance and beauty to describe say, an equation or a formula that describes a particular relationship or a particular process in very few and to them very clear steps. So for them, for people who think in math, beauty is a very important quality, and it's something that can be perceived. Again, particularly in this culture, we're trained to the opposite of that. We're trained into fear of mathematics, or what we term mathematics. And that's really a shame, because, again, it's not everybody's thing, but it's some people's thing. And something that I noticed happening once computers got sophisticated enough to be able to actually give some of the really beautiful and moving graphical representations of things, that there are wonderful videos that explain how higher dimensions are described in mathematics by showing them visually, geometrically. Well, that wasn't possible until like beginning in the 90s. You notice a difference in the people who chose mathematics as a field before the ease of visualization and after the ease of visualization. You get different types of people and different types of creativity. If you talk to algebraicists who worked in the 50s and 60s and 70s even, and the idea of visualizations of what they were doing is just anathema. It's like it's formulas. But once those formulas were able to be visualized, moving, you could explore them. Kids in college with a really different mindset started exploring these other mathematically idealized spaces to see what you could do with them. And that's just that shift certainly has become the way things are now. Enough generations have passed. But I find that interesting because it becomes easier with this graphical representation to sense the beauty in these realizations of higher dimensional forms once you can move through them. Anyway, that's,
And
I
it
guess,
can be done now through simulations, which, like you
Yeah.
said, couldn't be done before. I think this could be a good kind of a bridge to our next discussion, which I think we should talk about symmetry and asymmetry. Because today we've been talking about asymmetry, and the relationship to symmetry is an important factor in just about everything that Stan was doing. So, but we've run out of time for today. We've really got into a whole discussion that we haven't previously been able to do. So for now, we thank you for watching, and we will see you next time. Take care.